up on what Dr. Lumumba said, obviously the COVID-19 epidemic has changed the world. But this slide that I'm putting up here is a little bit of a play on Thomas Friedman's famous saying that the world is flat. Certainly the business world is flat. Of course, Thomas Friedman is a New York Times columnist and a New York Times author, bestseller. And he pointed out as the economies of the world have is to kind of show, particularly American audiences, that the GDPs of what we term the emerging economies of the world now exceed the GDPs of the developed world. And that means that if the world is truly flat, American businesses ought to be looking to do business outside the US more than they currently are. On the side, you can see it says 95% of consumers are outside of the US. And that's, let me move into the, there we go.
This way say something. Only the alignment.
So
please, can you mute your phone or your computer?
So the next slide is essentially to show that indeed, until the COVID virus, emerging and frontier markets are actually faster growing markets. So not only is the larger economy outside of what we consider the developing world, it's also a faster growing component of the world economy, and it's something that US companies ought to think about as they look to expand their business opportunities. So even though Thomas Friedman has rightly pointed out that business and even the COVID-19 can be transferred around the world because it's flat, unfortunately, when it comes to finance, the world has never been quite as flat. And the reason for that is that there are a variety of reasons that prohibit capitals from flowing into emerging markets. Most notably is the fact that there are risks, both real and perceived, that prevent people from either making investments in or doing transactions in markets that they perceive to be very, very risky. And there we can get into a whole host of reasons of what those risks are. It's everything from transparency to corruption, both real and perceived, to transparency, to foreign exchange risks, to language, to culture. There's a whole host of reasons that emerging markets and frontier markets have been viewed as being risky and therefore difficult to make investment in. And unfortunately, as I said, because the world isn't flat, the governments of the world have come up with programs to try and address this issue and make financing as fluid as, frankly, business has been in other sectors. And these institutions are known as export credit agencies or development finance institutions, which really are designed to facilitate cross-border transactions. So just very briefly, most nations of the world have export credit agencies. Their role is to support their home team's goods and services. In the US, we have the US Export-Import Bank. You've got export credit agencies around the world. Actually, the largest export credit agency in the world is China Exim Bank. And these institutions, out of their own self-interest, are trying to encourage countries in emerging markets, for instance in Africa, to buy their country's goods and services. And part of the incentive to buy their own country's goods and services is to provide financing schemes. And they essentially mitigate some of those risks, both perceived and real, that I mentioned before. And in this post coronavirus, and I know that's maybe being hopeful, their role is probably going to be even more critical. I sat in a forum a couple of weeks ago with the chairwoman of US Exim Bank, banks, and Exim Bank, like many other US institutions, is trying to do all they can to address issues that will help during this coronavirus. And what became clear in that conversation is, even though Exim Bank is talking about giving even more incentives for financial institutions to provide support to induce them to lend to companies who are exporting, a lot of the financial institutions pointed out right now, even with the incentives, they're not likely to do a whole lot more business, because their concern in the short run is their regulators who are saying, this is going to be bad, you need to pull back. And so while the private sector, rightly so, is pulling back, a lot of these government agencies realize they're going to have to lead in the vanguard. And they have traditionally always provided, as this last comment on the left-hand corner says, they've always provided this idea that they are a lender of last resort. So if I can't get term financing in Tanzania anywhere else, I should be able to go to an export credit agency, either in the US or Europe or in Asia, and they can oftentimes provide the financing where there is none other available. So that's the role of the export credit agencies. The other type of institution, and we're going to get into this a little bit more with one of my colleagues who's from formerly OPIC, now the Development Finance Corporation, is what we call development finance institutions. And these are both multilateral and bilateral institutions. Many of you have heard of the World Bank. It was previously mentioned, Africa Development Bank. These are multilateral institutions that are designed to try and lend and support projects in emerging markets. Every country also, or at least every developed world country, has a bilateral institution. In the US's case, it's this US Development Finance Corporation. The UK, Japan, all of the major economies of the world have these institutions, and they all essentially do the same thing, and that is they try and provide capital to good projects, and the schematic that I put on the board is kind of how this is done. A project, whether it be a road or an airport or a hotel, is developed. Typically, the project sponsors invest money. They may bring other equity contributions from other parties, and then the lender essentially provides money into that project as debt. And this kind of gives you the parameters of what a project finance looks like. They can lend up to as much as 75% of the total project cost in debt. Unlike traditional debt, they will tailor the grace period or the period that is required to pay back the loan over a longer period of time. They're willing to give payment terms for much longer periods of time than are likely available in the local markets. And as I say in the final two boxes, they primarily provide what we call limited recourse financing to projects. They can also, and actually in the case of the Development Finance Corporation, this is something that they have increased their charter. They can also do things like provide subordinated debt and equity. And that is something that allows that project to go forward. So in today's environment where coronavirus has disrupted everything, using these tools, whether it's the development finance institutions or the export credit agencies, are likely going to become more of a necessity than they were even 3 to 6 months ago. And I think the good news is that most of these institutions realize that. They're incentivized, and I go back to this conversation I had with the chairwoman of Exim Bank, who pointed out their mandate, their goal is to step in and provide liquidity because they know that the private sector is hurting. And I would encourage, as we look to Africa, there are two other slides, and we won't bother to go into that at this point. But I would encourage us to think about at this time when we're looking at a difficult market, to look to these export credit agencies and development finance institutions as tools that will help in developing Africa, which is going to be absolutely critical in the post-corona virus situation. And with that, I'll conclude.